Hello and welcome to this video, which is the second in a three-part series by the UPR Project at BCU, focused on supporting civil society organisations, or CSOs, to engage with the UN's Universal Periodic Review, also known as the UPR. You can find the other two videos linked in the description below or on our homepage, where you will also be able to learn more about the project, our work and our research. This is also linked down below. This video will support stakeholders with making SMART recommendations in their stakeholder submissions to the UPR. So let's get started. In its information and guidelines for stakeholder written submissions, the OHCHR advises stakeholders to consider making concrete and implementable recommendations. They also state that these should be SMART. The SMART criteria ensures that your recommendations are clear and actionable. Though there is no way to prove causation, there is data to suggest that stakeholder recommendations can influence and inform recommendations made by member states at the UPR. By ensuring that recommendations made by stakeholders are SMART, the UPR Working Group and other recommending states can be better positioned to be informed by them when formulating their own recommendations. With this in mind, let's break down these SMART criteria. First, recommendations should be specific. This means they need to be clear and precise, leaving no room for ambiguity. Specific recommendations clearly define what actions need to be taken, by whom and in what context. When recommendations are specific, it is easier for states to understand what is expected and for the UPR Working Group as well as CSOs and NHRIs to monitor progress. Vague recommendations can be interpreted in many ways, leading to unclear outcomes and limited accountability. As we are looking at CSO recommendations, we will take a look at some fictitious examples that can illustrate our points. Starting with specific, a vague example would be improve human rights education. This recommendation is too broad and does not specify what kind of improvement is needed or how it should be achieved. A better recommendation, at least on this criterion, is integrate human rights education into the national curriculum for primary and secondary schools. This recommendation clearly specifies the action, integrate human rights education, the target, the national curriculum, and the context, primary and secondary schools. Using action verbs such as establish, ratify, implement, amend, and abolish are a good way of achieving this. It should also be mentioned at this point that it is good practice to have one recommendation at a time, ensuring that each recommendation contains a single theme and a single action can more accurately convey what it is exactly that a CSO would like to see the government do to further human rights on the ground. Next, let's talk about what it means for a recommendation to be measurable. In the context of SMART recommendations, measurable means that the recommendation includes clear and quantifiable indicators that allow progress to be tracked and assessed. When recommendations are measurable, it's easier for the state to understand what is expected of it and for monitoring bodies to evaluate whether a progress is being made. Without measurable indicators, it's challenging to determine if and how a recommendation has been implemented. Let's look at some examples to illustrate our point. Increase women's participation in politics. This recommendation is well-intentioned, but lacks measurable criteria. It's not clear how much participation should increase, by when, and how success will be measured. An improved version would read, ensure at least 30% of parliamentary seats are held by women by the next election cycle. This recommendation is measurable because it specifies a clear target, 30% of parliamentary seats, and a time frame, the next election cycle. This allows for straightforward tracking of progress. Including measurable elements in your recommendations can take various forms, such as percentages, numerical targets, or specific milestones. For example, improve access to education could become increase primary school enrollment rates to 95% within the next 4 years. Or reduce poverty could read decrease the national poverty rate by 10% over the next 5 years through targeted social programs. Measurable recommendations make it easier to track progress as they define clear indicators, hold states accountable as the quantifiable targets can provide a basis for accountability, and of course, facilitate follow-up. Recommendations must also be achievable. They should be realistic and within the capacity of the state to implement. While it's important to aim high, setting goals that are too ambitious can lead to disappointment and inaction. From a research perspective, it could also skew statistics on implementation rates of UPR recommendations, and long term, this could negatively impact efforts to improve the impact of the UPR through research. It could also misrepresent country engagement with UPR recommendations. But from a CSO recommendation perspective, setting achievable goals is crucial for maintaining credibility and ensuring that your advocacy efforts lead to tangible outcomes. When recommendations are seen as realistic and grounded in the local context, they are more likely to be taken seriously by the states and more likely to be implemented successfully. This increases the likelihood of achieving meaningful change and sustaining long-term engagement with the UPR process. Turning to an example, eliminate all forms of discrimination within 1 year. This goal, again, while noble, is likely unachievable within such a short time frame, given the complexity of addressing discrimination. However, implement anti-discrimination training programs for public servants within 2 years sets a realistic goal that can be achieved within a specific time frame, making it more likely to be implemented and have a meaningful impact. This leads us to relevant. Relevant recommendations align with national priorities and the objectives of the UPR. They should address issues that are significant to the country's human rights situation. In other words, will this help improve the human rights situation on the ground? Relevant recommendations are more likely to resonate with the state and the UPR working group, increasing the chances of implementation. Recommendations that do not align with national priorities or the broader context of human rights may be overlooked. Consider the fictitious example on the screen. Increase funding for sports facilities in urban areas. Of course, sports facilities are beneficial. However, this recommendation may not address a pressing human rights concern relevant to the UPR process. However, enhance protections for freedom of the press by establishing an independent media regulatory body within the next 2 years is addressing a significant human rights issue and aligns with the UPR's objectives of improving governance and protecting freedom. Lastly, recommendations need to be time-bound. This means setting a clear time frame for implementation. Time-bound recommendations specify when the expected outcome should be achieved, creating a sense of urgency and facilitating process tracking. A specified time frame helps states plan and prioritize their actions. It also allows monitoring bodies to track progress and hold states accountable within a given period. Without a clear deadline, there is less pressure to act, and it becomes challenging to measure progress and ensure that commitments are being met. But while creating time-bound recommendations are crucial, CSOs should also be mindful of potential pitfalls. Here are a few things to avoid. First, setting deadlines that are too short can make recommendations unfeasible. For example, expecting a significant policy overhaul within 6 months may not be practical. To avoid this, ensure that the time frame is realistic given the state under review's current situation and capacity. This leads us to the next one, ignoring contextual factors. Don't overlook the local context and challenges that might impact the feasibility of meeting the deadline. Factors such as political instability, economic constraints, or existing infrastructure limitations should be considered. Avoid timeframes that are too broad or vague, such as in the near future or as soon as possible. These lack specificity and do not create a clear sense of urgency. However, while time-bound recommendations need specific deadlines, it's also important to allow some flexibility for unforeseen circumstances. Being too rigid can lead to recommendations being dismissed if the state faces unexpected challenges. You can mitigate this by considering interim milestones. Breaking down the goal into smaller, manageable steps helps in tracking progress and maintaining momentum. For example, instead of saying, reduce unemployment by 50% in 5 years, include milestones like reduce unemployment by 10% each year. Consider this example. Improve access to clean water. This recommendation is too vague and lacks a sense of urgency. So what about provide clean water to 100% of rural areas within 6 months? This is likely unachievable given typical logistical and resource constraints. So in order to make a realistic and time-bound recommendation, consider the following. Ensure access to clean water for 90% of rural households within the next 5 years, with an annual progress report to monitor implementation. This recommendation is specific, realistic, and includes a time frame and a mechanism for ongoing monitoring. So, now we've discussed the SMART criteria, let's talk about how to craft effective recommendations. Remember, we want to ensure that our recommendations are clear, concise, and aligned with the international human rights standards as well as the national context. First things first, we have to combine the SMART criteria. Here's an example recommendation. Reduce the incidence of child labour by 25% within the next 3 years by enforcing existing labour laws, increasing funding for school enrolment programs, and providing support services for affected families. Now, if we look at this through the SMART criteria, the recommendation clearly defines an action to be taken, reducing child labour by enforcing labour laws, increasing school funding, and providing support services. The progress can be tracked through the 25% reduction target in the incidence of child labour. It's also realistic and achievable within the given time frame, considering the state's capacity to enforce laws, allocate funds, and provide support. The recommendation is also relevant as it addresses a significant human rights issue, child labour, that aligns with both the international human rights standards and national priorities. And finally, the recommendation sets a clear deadline of 3 years for achieving the 25% reduction. Second, the recommendations need to be straightforward and to the point. Ambiguity can lead to misunderstandings and ineffective implementation. You can do this by using clear language, avoiding jargon and technical terms that may confuse non-experts, and keeping recommendations brief but comprehensive. Long-winded explanations can dilute the message you're trying to get across. On the slide, you can see 2 examples. Notice how the concise recommendation is clear and to the point. It specifies the goal, methods, and timeframe in a straightforward manner, making it easier to understand and actionable. By contrast, the long-winded recommendation, while thorough, includes unnecessary details and explanations that dilute the message. This can make it harder for audiences to quickly grasp the key actions and objectives. Finally, your recommendations should be aligned with the international human rights standards and national context. Where possible, make sure the reference to relevant international treaties and conventions, but equally make sure to tailor recommendations to the country's unique circumstances, considering existing policies, cultural factors, and resource availability. On the occasions you wish to refer to the implementation or lack thereof of recommendations from previous cycles, you should be very clear in identifying which recommendations you are citing. The OHCHR encourages referring to the Human Rights Council report, cycle, paragraph number, recommendation number, and recommending country. This will make it easier for recommending states to raise recommendations from previous cycles, which is one of the foundational principles of the cyclical nature of the UPR. Crafting sound CSO recommendations at the UPR should not be a passive process. It requires careful considerations and ample research. In the day of the internet, there is an abundance of resources and tools available to CSOs to support them in crafting effective recommendations for the UPR process. Leveraging these tools will help ensure that your recommendations are well researched, evidence-based, and aligned with both international standards and the national context. Starting with the most technical, having access to comprehensive data is crucial to crafting well-informed recommendations. You could utilize research databases and reports from reputable organizations to gather evidence and identify trends. These can fall into three broad categories that encompass a wide range of resources. For example, UN reports. Use reports from UN bodies such as the UN Human Rights Council, the OHCHR, and other specialized agencies to understand the current human rights landscape and the state's obligations. NGO reports. Support fellow NGOs and CSOs to refer to publications from international and local NGOs and other CSOs, which often provide in-depth analyses and case studies. Of course, this includes making references to your own reports and research. And thirdly, government publications. Government reports and statistics often offer valuable insights into the national context and existing policy framework. But of course, be critical in using this information where there is a disparity between theory and practice or inconsistencies in the information provided. Several organizations provide guidelines and toolkits designed to help CSOs draft effective recommendations. For example, UPR Info's Handbook and Toolkits page, which offers practical advice on how to engage with the UPR process. There's also the OHCHR's Practical Guide, which provides detailed instructions on how to prepare stakeholder submissions and formulate recommendations. There is also the matrix of thematically clustered recommendations posted by the OHCHR UPR country website that can be particularly useful when looking to reference and monitor recommendations and their implementations, or lack thereof. This video series is the product of a research study into strengthening the role of CSOs in the implementation of UPR recommendations. One outcome of which is a report that compiles our findings and recommendations as well as other very useful resources. This report can be found on the project's page linked below. Though this is by no means a comprehensive list, it's a good starting point in supporting your work. Now, to recap the video, SMART recommendations are essential because they ensure that your suggestions are clear, actionable, and impactful. Remember, your role as a CSO is crucial in the UPR process. Your insights, experiences, and advocacy efforts provide invaluable perspectives that can shape the recommendations made by the UPR Working Group and other recommending states. By actively participating in the UPR process and drafting SMART recommendations, you contribute to a more robust and effective human rights review mechanism. We encourage all CSOs to take full advantage of the tools and resources available to support your efforts. Utilize research databases, follow guidelines and toolkits, engage in networking and collaboration platforms, and invest in training and capacity building initiatives. These resources will not only help you craft better recommendations, but also strengthen your overall advocacy efforts. Thank you for watching and for your dedication to improving human rights. We hope you have found this video useful. Please check out our other videos in this series which discuss what the UPR is and how CSOs can engage with the implementation of UPR recommendations. Do visit our website for more resources and information about our project if you are interested. Together, we can make a difference in the pursuit of human rights for all.